to present to you for our ninth Ora Torah, again, Dr. Giacomo Lichtner from Victoria University. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. The movie is 2 hours, 20 minutes long, so Giacomo's going to talk for a few moments before the movie. Then we'll have an intermission for about 10 minutes, and then we'll continue the movie. And afterwards, Giacomo will speak some more, and you're free to ask him questions about the film and the things in the film. Okay. And Michelle, is it possible to turn the volume down?
Turn the speaker on? Because we can't hear while you're talking.
If they can.
Okay.
Do you think you can reach this? There's a volume gauge. No, up there. It's easier if you do it from up there.
Yeah, don't
Just
touch.
over there. I think.
Wait.
One. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I think that was. Well, good evening, everybody. Many of you I know before, others I haven't met. But as Michelle said, I'm Giacomo. I work at the history department at Victoria. I have been told to be brief, and I'll try. I'll try to be very brief. I don't want to be responsible for you being late tonight. But I'll tell you what though. I'll try the who ordered chips as a way to quieten a room in my lecture theatres. That was spectacular. I was going
to show them.
Sorry?
You've got to have chips to show
Well,
them.
that's right. Maybe a prop. It's not a bad idea. No, I was going to start tonight because I think this film is really a film about Jewish identity, which is the reason that Michelle and I picked it as a good part of the Ora Torah course. And I was going to start tonight with quite a complicated quote from a beautiful little booklet, short story really, called 8 Jews, written by an Italian literary critic called Giacomo de Benedetti, who survived the Shoah. And he starts by saying what it is for a Jew, what it means for a Jew to be Jewish is not something to be trifled with. And then goes on one of the most beautiful bits of prose that I can remember, but so beautiful that it was almost impossible to translate, I think. And also so beautiful that as I was trying to translate it, I thought, hang on, this is quite romantic, but I'm not sure that it gets there. And it really sort of follows the idea that being Jewish is something really intimate, that each person knows what it means to him or her, and that it's partly about memories, but partly about something much deeper even than memories, something that has been passed down from sort of ancestral background. And I thought, very romantic, but and I think quite an interesting idea, but nevertheless not necessarily true for everybody. What I want to do though, where I want to start from though, given the story that the film tells, the story of a little Christian Ethiopian boy who has to pretend to be Jewish in order to survive. I might start from one aspect of the history of Jewish identity, which is that of disguise. Now, if you think about it, from Egypt to Esther, to the history of the Jews of Spain and people either forced to convert or pretended to convert, to the many sort of much smaller daily traumas of and adjustments of integration in the diaspora. Disguise and pretending to be, not necessarily pretending to be, but adjusting to a world that asks us to be something slightly different than what we are, is something that is deeply inherent to Jewish history and Jewish identity. And it's not surprising then to see that in the representation of Jewish identity historically, that narrative ploy of having a disguise, either a Jew having to disguise as Christian, or more rarely a Christian to disguise as a Jew, is something that we see very often. And there are different models of that as well. I mean, one interesting model that you saw a lot of in the 60s, for example, was the idea that the disguise is permanent, really, and a sort of rejection of core values of Judaism. And of course we can't completely disregard the anti-Semitic model of this story, the story of these guys, which turns these guys into a kind of stratagem, an ability to con somebody, a double loyalty. But more often, especially in war films, what you'll remember if you think about examples is a kind of temporary disguise. So the Jew who temporarily pretends to be something else in order to triumph, to outsmart his opponents. So I think rarer is the reversal of this relationship. So the Christian who has to pretend to be Jewish in order to survive. And that's the characteristics that this film takes on. It's set in 1985, and it's the story of a 9-year-old Ethiopian boy who, as I said, is Christian, but his mother sends him on with the other Jewish Ethiopian immigrants as part of the Operation Moses, the rescue operation that the Mossad put up to take Ethiopian Jews from refugee camps, mostly in Sudan, to Israel. And the film follows this boy, now called Solomon or Shlomo, and the name is significant, I'll come to that in a minute, to Israel, where he experiences discrimination as a member of the community that Daniel Borstein has described as the indelible immigrants. Because in a country where everyone is an immigrant, the Ethiopians, because of the color of their skin, can never, or have struggled more. I don't think they can never is correct, but have struggled more than other communities to integrate, and have encountered some very significant discrimination. So the film tells a seldom told story of the Falasha, and thus it has been reviewed. And it was interesting with Benoit just a moment ago that to talk about how successful it has been in France, because indeed it has been very successful. And I think sometimes it has been so successful because reviewers have cottoned on to this particular story of the Falasha, but also to a kind of critique of Israel, a very honest, very fond, a very affectionate critique of Israel that comes out of the movie. I think that's particularly when you compare it to the reception of Michaliano's other films, the ones that don't deal with Israel. There is an interesting link here that explains, I think, an interesting link with the sort of latent and sometimes not so latent anti-Zionism of much continental European left, which explains why Michaliano's this particular film went particularly well in continental Europe. And yet I would argue that this film, this story, is not primarily about the Falasha or even about the State of Israel. And Michaliano himself said it when discussing a different film, Train of Life, with me in an interview that he gave me in 2006. When he quoted Godard's statement, Jean-Luc Godard, famous French filmmaker, his statement that what he was interested in was the black screen between the two images. Those were Michaliano's words in trying to recall it. The actual words of Godard were the interstice between two images. But the concept is the same. So he is interested in reading between the lines of the film. And if that's true, then what is at the interstice between the narrative, the story of Shlomo, the Falasha, and the broader intuition of the filmmaker? That's the question. And in order to answer that question, you need to think about the title, I think. The title is Va, Vi et Devient. So not just live and become, but go, live and become. Now go and live are pretty easy to work out. Go is go to Israel. Go now. Leave your mother. The traumatic event that starts the film. Live, survive. You know, go in order to survive. But become, and the film engages directly with this concept, is a much more complicated idea. Become what exactly? So to read, I think, to read the black screen in between the images, as Michaliano put it, you have to ask, you have to watch it thinking about what Shlomo is becoming, what he becomes, what that entails, and what it takes for him to become what he becomes. Now, those of you who were here last month and recognize some faces will remember a less than flattering analysis of Francesco Rossi's adaptation of The Truth, of Primo Levi's The Truth, that I gave in my last talk here, where I argued that Rossi misrepresented Levi's identity, adding, erasing, and amending it in ways that turned Levi, a Jewish man, into somebody with distinctly Christian traits. There are 2 points of contact between that film and this one. They are completely different films in every possible reason, really. But there are nevertheless 2 points of contact. The first is the relationship between the pursuit of accuracy and the pursuit of the truth. And you'll remember that I opened my talk last time suggesting that when historians look at film and they consider specifically accuracy, they're often as superficial as the film they're analyzing. What is realistic on the surface, in other words, does not necessarily translate in being a correct argument or a legitimate argument around the essence of the historical event that's being debated. Now, so I would argue that Va Vie Devient, Live and Become is not a film primarily about the Falasha, but rather a film that's primarily about Jewish history, Jewish values and Jewish identity. The second point of contact between the two films is the reversal of identity, which is, in my opinion, surreptitiously present in Rosie's film, but present here too, more candidly and infinitely more sensitively. Now, both these traits, a respect for history and a fascination with identity and its disguise, fit perfectly into Radu Mihailianu's body of work, overall body of work. Just think about his last three films. Train of Life, where the shtetl, in order to survive the Nazis, have to invent a fake train of deportation. Half of them have to disguise as Nazis. The other half have to pretend to be victims of the Nazis. And so disguise is at the center of that. His latest film, The Concert, also has disguise. When the Russian conductor who has lost his career because of defending Jewish Russian musicians pretends to be somebody else in order to resurrect his career by going to Paris with the orchestra. So at the center of Radu Mihailianu's work, there is always this concept of disguise. But the parallel, though, particularly the parallel between Train of Life, Train de Vie, and Live and Become, which, Train of Life comes out in 1998, this one in 2005, but then Mihailianu is somebody who takes his time to make films, goes further than the disguise. And I just want to share with you a moment of that interview from 2006. Train of Life ends at the end of this wonderful fairy tale narrative where everybody survives. It ends with quite a shocking zoom out where Shlomo's face, Shlomo is the schnorrer, the shtetl fool who's been telling the story. You just see his face, he's just telling you how everybody has survived, and then the camera very, very rapidly zooms out to reveal that he's in fact in a concentration camp, inmates uniform behind bars. I always took that to mean that of course everybody had been gassed, and Shlomo himself in turn surely would be gassed. Now Mihailianu in the interview broke to me that, well, that needn't be the case. I mean, that we don't see Shlomo die, so maybe he survived. I wasn't sure, but it's his film, so there you go. And this is what Mihailianu said to me. Shlomo is just another question, but I like questions. Shlomo finishes in Auschwitz alive, but it's the middle of the war and he's still in the camp. Did he survive? I don't know. And then he says, I answered an American journalist who was asking the same question, did Shlomo survive? By saying, if you remember Shlomo, then he will have survived, but if you forget him, then he will have died in the story. And then he went on. But I think in my answer I was being a little bit smart, which means, it probably was. And I was not completely happy with my answer. And so I did Live and Become, which starts also in a camp, a different story, nothing comparable in Africa, but still a traumatic experience. And that kid does survive. Maybe he is Shlomo, and his name is also Shlomo. And indeed, the boy is given the name Solomon, Shlomo. And I asked him, just instinctively, but can the schnorrer survive without his shtetl? The schnorrer is a typecast, is a character that only lives in Yiddish land. If you take away Yiddish land, the schnorrer cannot survive. And Mihailianu responded, well, he can survive, but he will never live like before, like every other survivor. So it is possible that, indeed it seems to be the intention, at least partially, for the filmmaker to link Shlomo in Trandevi with Shlomo, the 9-year-old Ethiopian in Live and Become. And I think, thinking about it, that this is quite an interesting way of linking the events that is very, very different from very trendy and frankly quite sort of relativist and uncomfortable trend to compare genocides that you see around. What Michaleanu is doing here is not comparing, but he's rather linking, finding and giving us a key to ask, if not quite answer, questions that go much deeper than questions than those about Israel and the Falasha, which are nevertheless very interesting and important, and at the same time engage with emotions that are much more intimate than the pity and the catharsis that you might feel if you don't understand the subtext of the film. So who does Shlomo become, and how do we answer the question of what's in between the images that Michaleanu was saying? Well, I think if you put it in the context of Michaleanu's entire oeuvre, this really, you can read this film as a film about Jewish history, Jewish identity, which is centered in Michaleanu's view, and I think it's quite an inspired view, around the sublime contradiction between being able, on the one hand, to adapt to foreign surroundings, and in the extreme even pretend that we are not Jews, and on the other hand, the ability to stay true, consistently true to core values. Now, as you watch, consider if Shlomo manages these two things. Is he able to adapt to his surroundings, and is he able at the same time to stay true to certain core values? And indeed, in his case, I would argue, learn those core values. I think we'll leave it at that. We'll start the film, and then perhaps I'll take questions afterwards. I don't really, expect.
And there will be an intermission. Giacomo will start the movie.
Good to go?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know how many of you had seen it before, and I think maybe some had seen it before, some hadn't. I don't know that it's a film where I can say, I'll take your questions, but what I'm really willing to do is sort of facilitate some sort of debate around it. And if you want to start, you can start, otherwise maybe I'll make a couple of comments. Okay, I'll start then. Well, one of the things that's I won't speak as a critic. I'll speak as a member of the audience, if that's all right. And one of the things that gets me every time about this film, and that is particularly rare, I think, is the absence of what film scholars would call the gaze. I mean, obviously there is a gaze there. There is a filmmaker with a camera who's looking at something, looking at people, looking at histories. But what you get often with filmmakers trying to understand the perspective of other people, different from him or her, is a kind of distance, which often leads into the overuse, the abuse of stereotypes, and when it comes to race, a kind of Orientalist gaze, where which I think here is completely absent. And the great thing, I think, is that Michaleanu is aware of it. He's aware that he is not Ethiopian. He cannot speak on behalf of the Ethiopians. And this is something that filmmakers struggle with, but often it's something they decide to ignore because they think telling the story is more important. And in some cases they're right, and it is something incredibly hard to do. But here you can see he's aware of it, and there's a couple of sequences that I wonder if you noticed, and you may have thought it was a problem with the DVD, but it isn't. And it's at the beginning when he's young and he's just lost his second mother, his first adopted mother. There's a couple of sequences where he's taken in after violent episodes at school, and there are no subtitles. Everything else is subtitled, but it's that lack of subtitles tells us that we are not meant to understand because he cannot understand. So there's that kind of displacement, is the filmmaker telling us, I understand that if I was him, I couldn't understand, and you need to be in the same place so that you don't get that cozy feeling of identifying too much with your character and yet retaining a kind of distance, a suspension. You have to suspend your disbelief, but also remember that you are the audience looking in. It's a really interesting distance to have. And another interesting episode, I think it's again telling of his awareness of the problems in telling somebody else's story, is in Yael and Yoram's family. The first sequence when he joins the family and he arrives and he's taken to his room, and they tried to make him feel at home by putting African things, and some are from Kenya, some are Maasai art. I mean, they have nothing to do with Ethiopia. There's a sticker saying "I love Ethiopia" with sort of a reggae undertone, and it doesn't make them bad people, but they cannot understand. So again, Micheliano is engaging with all these different approaches. Shlomo's, his adoptive families, the people around him, and it's the diversity that's really, really great about this film. But I think that's enough from me. I'll take comments on that.
I'd like to say just one thing I find interesting about this movie is each of the characters speak in the native language that you'd expect if it was a real life situation, as opposed to other movies where, let's say it was take a movie from the other month where you showed they were speaking English the whole time with an accent of German or Polish or whatever. So I quite like the way that this movie tries to make it realistic and get you a sense of what it means to be an Ethiopian through language, to be French, Jewish through language, etc.
Yeah, I think it's really important for that diversity that I was talking about, to get the audience. Although when you're reading the subtitles, I suppose, if you don't understand any of the three languages used, then maybe it doesn't make that much difference. But I think it's a good point. It's interesting that in his first film, Train de Vie, he doesn't do that. The shtetl speaks French with a Yiddish accent. So it's an interesting change from that.
I want to say that I actually, even though you're not supposed to like him so much, but the father portrays a real French-Jewish stereotype, how patriotic they are. And French Aliyah is one of the biggest in diaspora, and has been for some time. So that was really interesting how he really portrayed that really well.
Yeah, but beyond that, I don't think you're not supposed to like him. I think he's a stereotype maybe, but he's also a real character. He's a real person. He hasn't had the same journey with Shlomo as Yael has. He doesn't understand the difficulty of having two identities that clash all the time inside you. But I mean, the points he's making they are good points. That it's not. I'm not sure that we have to dislike him. I mean, I think the tension between families and the survival of your family first, and the responsibility towards country or a community or whatever, a broader group is a worthwhile thing to think about.
Does anybody know about how the Ethiopians are received in Israel today?
I'm not an expert in it. Perhaps
Daniel might know something.
Yeah, others might.
Do you know anything, Daniel?
I don't know much, but I mean, it's been an ongoing issue about the legitimacy of the conversions, whether they're actually Jewish. It's still, you see it in the papers today, like on Jerusalem Post, you'll see some article about it every now and again. I can't say I'm an expert, but...
Are there any kibbutz that have been predominantly settled by Ethiopians?
Kibbutzim, I'm not sure, but I have seen large communities that have sort of integrated in different ways. You'll have sort of the elders of the community would be more traditional, like you see in the movie, and then the younger generation typically will have kippah suga, knit kippah, and kind of join the sort of more modern Orthodox movements.
Where Shlomi is there not an Ethiopian shul?
I'm not sure.
Yes, there are. In the Yeshiva, there are a number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
the main problem Israel did with the Ethiopians was that when they came over, it basically destroyed the hierarchy in the family from coming to Israel, where the men were the ones that usually did the hard work in the tribal system. Then mainly the women were now the main workers of the family that bring the money in, not from good jobs or anything, but because they managed to find work. The language problem also put them a little bit backward in society. And when the men couldn't bring the money home, and the bread on the table, it actually destroyed their respect from the younger ones. Another problem they did is that when a lot of the Ethiopians and Russians came at the same time, the Russians were a lot more educated than the Western. So they managed to come out of we call them caravan camps basically. It was basically supposed to be temporary. The Russians easily came in, and within basically a couple of years, 2 years, 3 years, they would be out. The Ethiopians after 10 years were still living in the same place. And the last thing they did is that instead of trying to spread them around and actually bring them into the society, they kept them in big groups. And they just stayed together, and it's kind of held apart for many years. But in the last years, it's more and more mixed, and it's getting better, but slow.
That's an interesting problem, because in New Zealand, when we or certainly over the last 20, 30 years, when we've brought foreigners, quote unquote, into the country in groups, they started by trying to spread them out. Can you imagine a Somalian going to Westport by themselves in the midst of nothing compared to a group of people who knew only each other being a group together? And in a sense, I found that interesting, that he was quite isolated in the movie from the Ethiopian community, except when he had a problem, he went to the old man that he knew would be able to help him, not because he was an old man, but because he was Ethiopian and understood where he came from. That was sort of very different from the rest of the movie.
Well, that's part of my reasoning for saying at the beginning, before the film, that the film has aspirations to tell a story that goes beyond the first shot. And if he had wanted to make a political, it is political, but if he had wanted to make a film that was primarily about the politics of integration in Israel and so on, then he would have told the story of a family, an Ethiopian family coming into the country. And that, that problem of integration, which the balance between integrating and allowing people to retain their original culture would have come out much more. But whereas he wanted to tell the story of somebody with two identities that are clashing, and how you deal with that, and that's why language is so important, and distance. That the old man works as a surrogate for this missing family, Ethiopian family. I think there were a couple of hands.
I just wanted to say the title "Go Live and Become" makes me think of the Italian, Vini Vidi Vinci, which is I came, I saw, I conquered.
Yeah.
Sort of an interesting parallel, because between conquer and become, it just makes me think,
Well, it's an interesting parallel, but to become doesn't mean to conquer.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's like
yes,
opposites.
sure.
In this case, it's just,
No, sure.
Yeah.
You're right.
In terms of the actual storyline, I don't know if I missed something, but got a bit confused where the old man takes him to the doctor, and it's the same doctor that.
Yeah, they was in the camp.
Yeah. But I was expecting something to come from that.
Yes. Well, what comes from that is that he thinks about studying medicine.
Maybe,
Yeah, but you don't necessarily know what came.
You don't.
It doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah,
It doesn't spell anything.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few, especially in the second half, there are quite a few narrative weaknesses
That's right.
that I, skim over because I love the film so much.
I know.
But and sometimes you get the message right and the style is a little. But the truth is that there's two films in here. The first hour and a half, until just after we had our break, is in much more detail, and then it gets a bit more schematic because he has to get through all sorts of things. It's the dilemmas of the author who wants to tell a story and has only got this much time. It's surprising when you speak to directors and you go as a critic and you think, well, it's all about the message, and it isn't. It's all about comics. It's all about the economics of making films and distribution and so on. So in this case, 2 hours and 20 minutes is already long, and it was very, so that there are problems there that, you undoubtedly picked up.
I also have one question, I suppose, of a comment, but I don't think I ever picked up that he had any family name in that film. That's a big part of your identity. And so you were told that he took on the family name of the adopted family, or that he came with any Ethiopian family name.
He eventually takes on the Harari. Yeah. He does take on the surname of his.
So
that's his Israeli. No, his Israeli family. That's the French Israeli family. Yes. But I think Ethiopians don't have surname in the same way. I think they use the patronymic and maybe the place they come from. I don't know for sure, but I suspect they don't have family names like we do in that sense. You see what I mean? Yeah. But the identity is stripped off him. It's actually quite beautifully portrayed at the beginning when he arrives in Israel. You see the bending of the clothes, and there's a kind of regeneration.
They made very little of his original Ethiopian name, which I don't actually remember hearing.
It's true.
There may have been, but that was a very minor.
Yes.
Was that cultural arrogance that was
The old guy said that he was reborn when he was found basically. Basically, when he took the old name and gave him the new one.
He has to become as long. He can't become as his old self.
But even in the beginning, when he was building the opium, he didn't have a name.
Yeah.
But it was quite powerful later when he finally tells the story of all the names of all his brothers, his died, his sister died.
What did you make of the end? Because this is a Micheliano sort of characteristic, the zooming out. He ends, he ends Rendezvous with a big zoom out. This is an even bigger zoom out. What did it? I mean, it's not as powerful perhaps as the one in Rendezvous because it's not revealing that the story has been false, but it's still quite powerful.
Yeah, I think it's quite frightening because the truth is that it's still like that in the camps in the Sudan, and there's still millions possibly of Ethiopians there, and in lots of other places in the world, refugees and kind of.
I mean, I think that's a quite likely explanation that it's
one story.
And again it's something that Micheliano is quite severe with that. It's quite strict. He doesn't want to let you have any way out. So the catharsis that you might get from having him find his mother, just think of life is beautiful and how you feel at the end when the child meets his mother again. No? That sort of relief, you can't even feel that. He's quite brutal and quite zealous in how he thinks about aesthetics and emotions. And so just at that moment when you think, oh, he's met his mum again, it's like, yeah, but what about everybody else? And also sort of abstracting you from the action. The first thing that jumped out at me when I first saw that zoom out was the clay. Really. Although I have to say, watching it again, it's not quite as red as I remembered it. I think in my mind it became redder because we look for symbols where there aren't really any sometimes, but nevertheless. And what about that sequence about the discussion, the controversy, the Buddhi controversies? Again, in every Micheliano film, there's a moment like that when he gives you his take on religion, which is kind of sort of.
With the grandfather, you mean?
No, at the Talmudic controversy, the debate, where he has to discuss the color of man. And some of you have seen Trandavi. There's a moment there where they're in a camp, in a field, having dinner, and the communists and the religious people fight over the blessings and so on. And then it's all settled when the Schnorrer says, says something about how God created man and then man created God in return. And this is very similar when he talks about Adam being red like clay. It's Michaliano's way of approaching religion as somebody who's secular, but also really, really interested in mysticism. And it's another take on a sort of Jewish relationship with God, which has infinite, faces. And it's quite an interesting scene again.
I kind of felt the dialogue with the policeman was a little bit forced.
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
Right. Like he wanted to represent one perspective.
Yeah.
But it's almost like he said everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing perhaps where, I said at the beginning how I really value the perspectives here. And they're all quite honest and all quite sensitively handled, except perhaps the perspective of Orthodox Jews in Israel, which I think come off a little bit stereotypical and a little bit harshly. And I think that's his political point of view coming through. There's sort of little respite for them. And the Romanian policeman is the opposite. It's another example of the Israeli life that Michaliano likes. And it's interesting he should be Romanian because Michaliano is also Romanian. And I don't know whether there's anything there, but it's, yes, it is forced. Yeah.
I was going to say in terms of the policeman, how I read him was that he himself had gone through the whole process of having to accept others who weren't like him. And so he was simply, he's barging in on top of him saying, oh no, it's all right, because he's reinforcing his own belief that he finally came to. That's how I saw it. Yeah.
And perhaps the offer of, come and see me and be a policeman too.
Yeah.
Sort of thing, it's like he's found a way somehow and tries to show Shlomo that it might be all right.
I mean, a lot of it was open up. Oh, go ahead.
No, just one refugee trying to help another refugee.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that the Romanian policeman we can see really as a refugee, but what I get out of there is again the need to let people speak with their own voice. Yeah, and it's something that in really without realizing we're constantly fighting with the temptation. When you want to help somebody, to help you on your own terms rather than on theirs. And he needed to be able to speak. The guy was sympathetic, but he didn't allow him to speak. So what do you think of the parallel between, the director made himself, between Shlomo, the Holocaust survivor, and Shlomo, the Ethiopian famine survivor? He calls the two characters, the man who survives the Trandavi and the young boy with the same name for an obvious reason. And he creates a link explicitly, or he created a link explicitly in the interview with me between them and between their experiences and the displacement of survival, the struggle of survival. After, the struggle of survival that starts when you survive rather than up to the moment where your survival is achieved. What do you think? Do you buy that? Because quite often, I can assure you, directors will tell you things about their own films which you don't have to believe. Yeah? Just, there is a sense of self-preservation and self-representation.
I think it's often the other way around, where everyone else comes up with this amazing analysis of a book or a movie, and when you talk to the author, they say, never thought
well, yeah, it's often that way around, but sometimes it's also the other way around. I can tell lots of examples of directors saying sometimes many years afterwards, saying, "Oh, it was always about that," and it's just posturing. I don't think this is the case, frankly. but I also, we also don't have to just accept it. And it may be that the parallel is meant but doesn't work, or it does work. I don't know. I don't know what you made of it.
But at the beginning, that Holocaust wouldn't show sort of in reverse or the same symbols in totally different context. I saw the other book. I thought that might be.
I like the idea of just being displaced and was really strong without being like overpowered in like dialogue. And I felt the same way about the racist issues. It was like obviously there in the movie, but it wasn't like, I thought the idea of displacement and being at odds with your surroundings was a lot stronger.
Yeah, particularly the first hour, I think it's the best part of the movie, that analysis there. And I think that's where Michael is talking also in part about his own experience. Because, to be the son of a communist Jew in Romania, who's changed his name to sound more Romanian and less Jewish. Communist Jew, also survivor of a Nazi work camp. And then, so the director became theatre actor and director in the Yiddish theatre in Bucharest. Not an easy thing to be under Ceausescu. So then in the 80s he ran away to Israel, then from Israel to France. And it's, going back to the reception of this film, so perhaps cyclically, he said, we spoke quite a lot about reception, and he said, and I wanted to press him on why Femme de Vie was so badly received, not even badly, just really snobbishly received by the French press. And eventually, he didn't want to speak badly about the press for obvious reasons, but eventually he said, well, now that I wanted César with Live and Become, I'm a French director, but before that, I was a Romanian director. So, he was very sensitive about not representing himself as a victim of anti-Semitism. And I think he was absolutely right, and I don't think anti-Semitism necessarily has a lot to do with film reception, but in France, he's a foreigner. In Israel, he's a foreigner. In Romania, he was a foreigner. So displacement is something that's really close to him, and I think that's probably why that first hour packs a punch much more than the second, which is more prosaic about telling, finishing the story in a sense.
And we're all foreigners.
We're all foreigners. Amen. Excellent. I think it's probably.
Good. Thank you very much, Giacomo. I think we may be able to squeeze Giacomo in for another night during the rest of the months ahead. I just wanted to say before you all go that next week Rabbi Alima is talking, and he's actually not talking that much during the 6 months, so it would be wonderful if you want to learn some Gemara to do attend Rabbi Alima's talks. Yeah, he's going to continue what dreams mean in the Gemara as well as other topics. And afterwards we have Efrat Alima talking on the same night as Margolis is doing her fundraiser. So we're going to have an earlier Ora Torah, which will finish earlier at 7:15, so that you can go to see Margolis at 7:30 at Shul. And the week after that we have Daniel Frank for his third and final talk for Ora Torah. And after that, Rabbi Lima one more time, and then on the 18th of June we have Rabbi Adi Cohen, and we'll have a different phase in Ora Torah. So please do have a look online and through our Facebook page, and also think about what topic you want to do for your personal project. You have the chance now to think about what Jewish area you want to research. You can analyze your own Jewish film if you want. And the idea is for you to write a 2 to 3 page document that at the end I hope to gather, and we'll do our own mini presentations and hopefully have that published. So start thinking about your topics.
It's not compulsory, by the way. It
No.
sounds like
It sounds like, I know, it's like being at work.
Because we are mirroring this according to what we had experienced in Paris, which includes a learning component and a transmission component. So this is what you can contribute to your own Jewish learning and for other people in the community to read, which we really love. But it's not compulsory. So Thank
highly
you.
recommended.
Well, I'm very happy to to consult if anyone wants to do something on film.
I'm sure my mother. Thank you very much.